Um, so before I begin, I'd just like to thank Shadayu and Dharmeshwari for their wonderful presentations yesterday. It's really excellent. I always love reconnecting to, in particular, the reactive and creative mind, those distinctions and how we travel from one to the other. And Dharmeshwari said, she said a sentence, I think in passing in a way, that really struck me. And that she said, my life was out of control because I was in charge of it. I said, wow, that's amazing, actually. I thought you could have a whole retreat just on that sentence, in fact. My life was out of control because I was in charge of it. That says quite a lot. If we reflect on that, it says quite a lot about who we are as sort of unenlightened human beings. But anyway, thank you for those wonderful explorations. So my presentation or talk I've called it a compassionate heart is the refuge of the whole world. A compassionate heart is the refuge of the whole world. And this is a sentence from Nyanaponika Thera's wonderful book, The Vision of Dhamma. And I owe him a lot of gratitude for, in a way, his exploration of a sutta forms somewhat the basis of this presentation. And at the same time, I would also like to thank in advance Padma Vajra, Sangharakshita, and really all my spiritual guides, my mentors, teachers, and so on, who have helped me be here today in a way. There's an opera by the German composer Paul Hindemith called Matisse der Maler, which means Matisse the painter, written finished in about 1934. And it's inspired to some extent by what's called the Eisenheim Altarpiece, which is a set of paintings on an altar in Eisenheim in Alsace, which shows various things like a consort of angels. It shows the temptation of Saint Anthony, and on the base of the altar it shows the entombment of Christ. And the sort of story of the painting is that the hero is the painter Grunewald, who painted this altarpiece. And so it's taking place in, I think it's like the late 15th century, and Grunewald is a sort of a court painter, and there erupts a sort of violent and bloody peasant rebellion. And Grunewald knows perfectly well that the peasants need uplifting. They're in a terrible state, poor, hungry, few possessions, and so on. And so he sympathizes with them, and he's in torment because he feels, what am I doing here, privileged as a court painter? So he decides to go and join them and help their cause. But quite soon he's sort of horrified by the violence that he sees in this rebellion. And he retreats to a forest to sort of contemplate, what should I do about this? What can I do personally? And when he's in the forest, he has a dream. And in the dream, the painter, Grunewald, is visited. He sort of in the dream becomes, in a way, Saint Anthony, which is one of the subjects of the painting. And he, the painter, also Saint Anthony, is visited by Saint Paul. And Saint Paul tells him, he says, you shouldn't actually be here. You should be doing what you do best, which is painting, which is creating. This is how, in fact, you will be faithful to the people. This is how you will inspire the people to be better citizens, and so on. And so, as a result of this sort of vision, Grunewald goes back. This is in the opera. Goes back, and in a huge burst of creativity, paints this very triptych, or this very altarpiece rather, and the entombment of Christ is the final thing that he paints, and then he dies in a sort of exhausted by his creative efforts, and that's the end of the opera. And I think this story is quite relevant because I think, you know, we see a world that is afire, and we obviously want to do something about it. And what should we do about it? This is obviously the, in a way, the eternal question for people who, you know, have any sense of responsibility, of compassion, and so on. So even the title of this retreat, "Change Your Mind, Change the World," implies certain things, that it's by beginning to transform our minds that we can better change the world. And we don't have to look far at all to know that, you know, the world, our world, in this very day and age, is afire as it was in Grunewald's day. There's obviously huge environmental degradation. There's great economic inequity. There's obviously right now there's political instability right here in the US. And I read the other day that in the United States, there's great food insecurity. Something like 90 million Americans are food insecure, which is kind of unbelievable. You know, I grew up with my father as an international nutritionist, and so I'd hear about food insecurity in Africa, Indonesia, and so on. And but here it is. Well, it's always been here to some extent, but it seems to be getting worse. So we want to do something. We need to do something about the world on fire. So we're going to begin with, I'll begin with looking at a short sutta from the Samyusan Nikaya. And we'll be sort of investigating that in some depth. And then I'll be looking again at mind, similar in the way to what Shidai talked about yesterday. And then we will see what, you know, how this relates to what we can do about the world. So here is the sutra. It's about a minute and a half long. Once the Buddha in the town of Siddhartha said, "Bhikkhus, there was once a pair of jugglers who performed their acrobatic feats on a bamboo pole. One day the master said to his apprentice, 'Now get on my shoulders and climb up the bamboo pole.' When the apprentice had done so, the master said, 'Now protect me well, and I shall protect you. By protecting and watching each other in that way, we shall be able to show our skill, make a good profit, and safely get down from the bamboo pole.' But the apprentice said, 'Not so, master. You, O master, should protect yourself, and I too shall protect myself. Thus, self-protected and self-guarded, we shall safely do our feats.' 'This is the right way,' said the Blessed One, and spoke further as follows. 'It is just as the apprentice said, I shall protect myself. In that way, the foundations of mindfulness, satipatthana, should be practiced. I shall protect others. In that way, the foundations of mindfulness, satipatthana, should be practiced. Protecting oneself, one protects others. Protecting others, one protects oneself. And how does one, in protecting oneself, protect others? by the repeated and frequent practice of meditation? And how does one, in protecting others, protect oneself? By patience and forbearance, by a non-violent and harmless life, by loving kindness and compassion. So the sutta shows the dynamic, in a way, and a non-separable relationship between inner work, our inner work, and its outer consequences. And the sort of kernel, I suppose, or heart of the sutra is that line, that double line: protecting oneself, one protects others; protecting others, one protects oneself. And so these lines, in a way, are actions. We actually have to do something, and the consequences of those actions. And of course, the method the Buddha recommends is the practice of satipatthana, the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And along with, I suppose, the Anapanasati Sutta, the Satipatthana Sutta is one of the great Buddhist, in a way, treatises on how we meditate. And I suppose the main thrust of the Satipatthana is to move us in a direction of contemplating, in particular, conditionality. And through that contemplation, really looking at the 3 lakshanas, those marks of existence, so impermanence, dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, and non-self. And the 4 foundations themselves are body, feelings, mind, and what are called chittas, or sort of mental states. And it's through these contemplations, in the end, of course, the purpose is to gain insight and then liberation. There's an important refrain that occurs between each of the 4, or just before each of the 4 steps, as it were, the 4 contemplations. And part of it goes like this. And the Buddha says, in this way, one abides contemplating either the body, feelings, mind, chittas, dharmas, etc. One abides contemplating internally, externally, internally, and externally. And the internal part refers to the meditator, to me. The external generally refers to other people. So, for instance, when I contemplate all aspects of my body, sort of skin, flesh, bones, and so on, and my death, I do that internally. I really imagine this is just a bunch of skin, flesh, bones that I have. They're not permanent, they change. I shouldn't be so attached to them. I can contemplate my death. It's going to happen, I know it's going to happen, and so on. But then I take that out of myself and I see that other people have the same skin, flesh, and bones, pretty much identical. They're not permanent, they're going to change. They would be wise not to get attached to them as well. And that other people also are mortal, they will also face death. And in a way, there's a sort of you might say there's sort of a Tonglen attitude to this. There's an other regarding, which of course is very healthy. And in a way, Shantideva, I'm just going to read 2 verses of Shantideva, says kind of, he had the same advice, and Shantideva says, if it is argued that to resist anger is inappropriate, for who is it that resists what? Our view is that it is appropriate. Since there is dependent origination, there can be cessation of suffering. Therefore, even if one sees a friend or an enemy behaving badly, one can reflect. that there are specific conditioning factors that determine this and thereby remain happy. So what he's encouraging us to do, of course, is to yes, we need to look in, but we need to look out as well. We need to do both. So from the sutta, we have this line: how do we, in protecting ourselves, protect others? And of course, we can say there are various levels that we can approach this. There's a sort of a quite practical, simple level. We can not get drunk. We can drive mindfully and carefully. We can speak kindly to whoever we encounter. Of course, in this day and age, I hope it's not a political thing to say. It's not. It's a matter of safety and mindfulness. We can wear masks when we go outside. We protect ourselves and we protect others by wearing masks. And there's an ethical dimension to this line. In protecting ourselves, we protect others. So in practicing the 5 precepts, we protect others. If we let our lives be governed by the 3 poisons, greed, hatred, and ignorance, and often we do, as Shidai mentioned yesterday, sometimes we know very well our minds get polluted, so to speak, and we act out of greed, hatred, and ignorance. So when we do this, this contributes in a way to the inequities of the world. It contributes if we're greedy and we don't care about where something comes from. If it's, let's say, food, we can contribute to a degraded environment. If I get angry, if I get jealous, right, that can contribute to not helping others, of course. It's sort of fairly obvious. I remember sometimes I get sort of frustrated. I'd sort of, like to bang a cupboard door. I don't do it much these days, but and sometimes we have cats, and the cats would they'd know, right? They'd know. They'd race out the kitchen, let's say, and I feel so bad, that my actions have had a negative effect on these poor creatures. And there's the wisdom level. So when we act with more wisdom, we protect others. We have this expression, we have to tidy up our own house first, don't we? And of course, our own house really is our mind. So our job, in a way, our task is to purify our mind. Now I was wondering, if there's a kind of a ratio, a correlation. So to the extent that I have a pure mind, that is the extent to which I can truly help and change the world for the good. And of course, the Dhammapada, which we've all know well, I hope, the Dhammapada at the very beginning says, experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows, like a shadow that never departs. So what is a pure mind? What is an undefiled mind? And how do we achieve that? So we're going to go back briefly to the 8 consciousnesses that Shadayu spoke of yesterday from the Yogacara tradition. So, well, we could have a little test if you like, but we won't. If you remember that we had the 5 sense consciousnesses, and then the mind that sort of sees them. And we have the what's called the klishta manas, the so-called tainted mind, which mistakenly sees consciousness both in terms of subject-object and in terms of a fixed self. Then finally, if you remember, at the sort of deepest layer of consciousness, we have the alaya vijnana, the so-called store consciousness. And if you recall further, this store consciousness, the alaya vijnana, is perfumed by our willed actions and produces sort of karmic seeds, which can be wholesome or unwholesome. And eventually these seeds reach fruition and result in, well, in good or ill. So the depths of our mind are perfumed by what we do, what we hear, what we think. If I act out of generosity, love, or wisdom, or if I act from greed, hatred, and ignorance, the effects will find themselves as seeds perfuming my deepest layers of the mind. And T.D. Suzuki has called these actions, these are our habit energies, these seeds, our habit energies, which in a way sums it up excellently. And, you know, I haven't done so well, but I was quite into for a while reading books about the brain and the mind, and sort of the latest on, you know, the plasticity, for instance, of the adult brain. And it does seem that research into this neuroplasticity affirms sort of that what we do put into our mind physically changes it. Even very small actions physically change the neural structure of our brain. And Padma Vajra, in an excellent talk on Zen Buddhism, talks about the alaya vijnana. And in his inimitable way, he gets quite excited, and he says the following. He says, we get very concerned, quite rightly, about the poisoning of our rivers and oceans, all the effluent, the raw sewage, the crap that we just throw in. But what about the mind? What about the sewage, the crap, the rubbish that we just tip in on a daily basis into our mind? What about the anxiety or the resentment and the ill will? It's all sewage and crap that we're just pouring into the depths of the mind. And it leaves its effect. Its effect is pain and suffering. So we do well, I would do well, to keep that, well, it's a warning, isn't it? It's a warning in mind. And of course we can perfume the mind, our mind, my mind, with the lovely. We can perfume it with the skillful. We can perfume it with the beautiful. So the sutta says, by protecting ourselves, we protect others. And I think the surest way, in the end, it's a long task, of doing this, of protecting ourselves, is to loosen the grip of the very notion of self. Isn't it, after all, the ego, our ego, that is in the end the cause of suffering, the cause of dukkha, of unsatisfactoriness? And another ratio, to the extent that I am egoful, to that extent I am unable to help or protect others. We could probably reflect on some aspect of our life and sort of see, I imagine we could look at that ratio in our own lives and see its relevance in a way. To the extent I'm egoful, to that extent I'm unable to help and protect others. And conversely, to the extent that I'm free of ego, to that extent I can protect others. in a way, it's quite easy to forget, but in a way, the entire thrust of the Buddhist vision is to help us lift this veil of self and other. Because, our tendency is to experience the self, myself, as solid and fixed. And it's quite normal, it's quite natural, really, to do that. So we have to do our best again and again to loosen this feeling of a fixed self. It's not fixed, it changes. So I'm going to hopefully try and demonstrate this with a little sort of experiment. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to close your eyes. This will take a minute or two. To close your eyes, sit mindfully, and experience, without too much thought, hopefully, experience what is happening, and particularly embody the experience as much as we can, so through awareness of the body. And when you hear something, just receive it as best you can, hopefully without opening your eyes, and maintain that embodied awareness. Keep sitting. Okay. So my suspicion is that when we were sitting quietly, we had a certain experience of ourselves, and that when the music began to play, it's probably something we all know quite well, our experience of ourselves both was immediately quite different and changed over the course of even just 2 minutes. I would be surprised if we didn't have that changing experience of self. And of course, this is something that we need to keep in mind. That it's very helpful to keep in mind that our self is mutable. It changes. It's the flow of experiences, I suppose you might say. And it's because of that, of course, that we can change, right? But we often forget, particularly when we're in the throes of a strong emotion like jealousy, like anger, and so on, that the self is not fixed, right? It's not fixed. We forget that. So to go back to the sutra, how does one, in protecting oneself, protect others? And the Buddha says, by the repeated and frequent practice of meditation. So by repeatedly and frequently working on the mind in meditation, we can intensify and fortify the ethical and wisdom aspects of our lives. And I think, we can see this particularly clearly when we've been on a retreat in which there's been a lot of meditation, a lot of silence. Things just become clearer. Our ethical practice just seems to be a lot easier. And I mentioned, I gave a little talk on the winter stillness retreat, and I mentioned in that talk that as a result of a Satipatthana practice I've been doing inspired by Analayo, I've been contemplating death every day, actually, without exception, for about 3 months. And it's the first time I've done this on a regular basis. It's the first time I've done this repeatedly. And what's very interesting, maybe it's not surprising, but it's very interesting that it does seem to have had quite a significant effect on my life. Things just seem to be a little bit lighter, even a little bit easier when things sort of don't go the way I want them to go. So, oh, well, okay, and I'm pretty convinced that it's because of this particular part of my meditative life. Nyanaponika Thera points out that self-protection and protection of others correspond to the great twin virtues, these are his words, they correspond to the great twin virtues of Buddhism, wisdom and compassion. Right self-protection is the expression of wisdom. Right protection of others is the expression of compassion. And of course, Sangharakshita, he looks at this in a similar way in his talks on individualism and altruism in the spiritual life, on the Bodhisattva Path series. And of course, in the final analysis, wisdom and enlightenment, wisdom and compassion merge at enlightenment. We in a way see them, experience them differently, but in the end, they are just reflections of the same thing. And in the final part of the sutra, the Buddha asks, and how does one, in protecting others, protect oneself? By patience and forbearance, by a non-violent and harmless life, by loving kindness and compassion. And this, in a way, is sort of quite straightforward. If we're patient with others, it's likely that conflict and and hostility towards us will be avoided. If we lead a life of non-harm, a life of non-violence, it's much less likely that we'll be met with harm and violence. If we radiate metta and are free of anger and hatred, it's unlikely we'll be met with ill will. So, in conclusion, I'm just going to say, as I started, we live in a difficult world. I'm going to read just a little bit of a poem by Adrienne Rich, who says it better than I do. She says, "Here is a map of our country. Here is the sea of indifference, glazed with salt. This is the haunted river flowing from brow to groin. We dare not taste its water. This is the desert where missiles are planted like corns. This is the breadbasket of foreclosed farms. This is the birthplace of the rockabilly boy. This is the cemetery of the poor who died for democracy. These are the suburbs of acquiescence, silence rising fume-like from the streets. This is the capital of money and dolor, whose spires flare up through air inversions, whose bridges are crumbling, whose children are drifting blind alleys, pent between coiled rolls of razor wire. I promised to show you a map, but you say this is a mural. Then yes, let it be. These are small distinctions. Where do we see it from is the question. Where do we see it from is the question. Do we see it from and with a purified mind, or a mind veiled by the defilements of greed, hatred, ignorance? And I can ask, we can ask, what is my task? What is my task on planet Earth? I have to go deeper. I have to keep plugging away at purifying my mind. John Kabat-Zinn says, there is no successful escaping from yourself in the long run, only transformation. I have to be as open and receptive and courageous as possible. The word courage comes from cœur, heart. Can I be ever more vulnerable and let in the difficult world? Can I be a flame that transmutes samsara into nirvana? In our own way, we can contribute to building a new society right here, a Buddha land right here to create a new culture where meditation is the norm, where cultivating ethics is the norm, where trying to lead a simpler life of less attachment is the norm. And right here in our house, in our work, with our friends, with our Sangha, we can do this. But don't expect results, even though they will eventually manifest. Don't expect results. Just do the work of purifying your mind and therefore protecting the world. There's a lovely story of our Sangha, who's in fact one of the founders of the Yogacara. So it seems that for year upon year, our Sangha, who was really already in a way a Bodhisattva, a saint, for year after year he strove for a vision of Maitreya, who was said to be the next Buddha. Kept meditating. I want to see, I'm longing to see Maitreya, but Maitreya never came. And he did this year after year with no results. And finally, he just gave up. He just gave up his sort of quest to see Maitreya in a vision. And right at that moment, he happened to see a suffering dog in the middle of the road, and full of compassion, he bent down to help this poor creature. And the dog was Maitreya. So we never know rarely what the result of what we do will be. So we just put them aside, do the work we need to do. Every time we act skillfully, wholesomely, with love and generosity, each time we do that, a drop does go into that bucket, as Jessica said yesterday. The seeds in our store consciousness are perfumed positively. By perfuming our minds with wisdom and compassion, we can turn toward the possible, live more easily with the radical uncertainty of the world. When we perfume our minds with wisdom and compassion, we can have confidence that in doing so, in protecting ourselves, we are protecting the world. We can be confident, each one of us, that our own wise and compassionate heart is indeed the refuge of the whole world. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. So first of all, I really want to thank Sravaniya for that beautiful talk. Really inspiring. That was just marvelous. I find it, so the four of us on the team, we knew at a high level what each of us was going to talk about, but we did not confer about the specifics of any of our individual talks. And I'm just remarking at how wonderfully this is all tying together, which I suppose shouldn't be a surprise because that's what the Dharma is all about. And my talk is really essentially the same talk as Sravaniya's, except that I'm coming at it from a completely different angle. So my talk is how to be a bodhisattva without burning out. And so all the wonderful things that Sravaniya talked about, giving us the dharmic underpinnings of what wisdom and compassion look like. My talk is about my personal experience of what it might look like to actually enact a life that tries to follow those principles. I do not claim to be a bodhisattva by any means. I am a bodhisattva in training. And I think I'm guessing that many of us here feel the same way, that we aspire to live by those principles. So this past week, in terms of what's happening in our country this past week or two, I think it's put a lot of us on edge. Not to mention all the other stuff that's going on, climate change, economic inequity, all the things that Sravaniya mentioned. And it's very easy to immediately jump to feeling like, what can I do? Because it does feel like the world is on fire. So I mentioned this image of the Bodhisattva. So a Bodhisattva is someone whose entire reason for existence is to be of benefit to others. And they immediately jump into action wherever and whenever they see suffering happening. So they tirelessly put all of their energy into helping others day and night without regard for themselves. If you really think about it, this image is obviously absurd. Obviously, because there's no way that any one person can save the suffering of all the world. And I feel that it can actually even be dangerous to get a little bit too caught up in that image. Because even though logically and realistically we know that it's ridiculous and impossible to do that kind of, put out that kind of effort, we can still get caught up in it. I know I do. And the more we try to emulate that ideal and we don't take into account all the background preparation that needs to happen, Um, it's kind of like jumping into the deep end of the pool without knowing how to swim, and disaster happens for us. So, so what I wanted to talk about is some of the things that I've done to try and avoid drowning in the deep end. So I hope that some of my mistakes can help you from possibly drowning. There's so many different angles on this subject. So I've selectively chosen 3 examples from my own life that I'd like to talk about. So these 3 are: number 1, self-care is absolutely essential. 2, don't try to fix samsara. And 3, you're not in this alone. Okay, so those are the 3. So number 1, self-care is essential. You may have heard the analogy that self-care is kind of like car maintenance. You know, you need to keep your car well maintained so that it runs reliably and smoothly. You know, it's there for you when you need it. But thinking about self-care or any spiritual practice in that way is kind of superficial and limiting, in my opinion. As many of you know, I am a doer by personality type, very much an achievement-oriented kind of person. And if you're my personality type, it's really easy to let self-care fall by the wayside when it feels like there are a million other things that I need to do. And, you know, I mean, if you're really busy, I bet you put off car maintenance too, right? You know, it's just not the top of the list. It can wait until I get some of these more important things done first. But self-care is not optional. Let me underline that in red multiple times. And rather than thinking of it as the car maintenance analogy, which is way too easy to put off, I like to think of it more as like what Dharmashuri was talking about. At one point, she talked about um, her practice as being like a new pair of glasses that helps her to see things more clearly. And that's an analogy that I find really helpful too. Self-care is an opportunity to be fully with yourself, to help you to understand yourself better at deeper levels of your psyche, to cultivate that more creative mind, that open and spacious mind that Shudayu was talking about yesterday. So it's a deeper, it's a doorway to a deeper self-awareness and self-knowledge that in itself is part of our process of awakening. You know, it's not this sideline maintenance thing we're doing. So here's what self-care has looked like for me at the core of my practice. My self-care routine involves a daily body-based practice that includes stretching and physical therapy exercises, Tai Chi, in addition to of course, my sitting meditation practice. Um, it's really a wonderful way to tune into myself, and a lot of times I don't really sense how I really am today until I sit down and do those things. You know, how am I really feeling today? You know, what's the sense of my energy? How's my mood? You know, really tune into that at a level that I am not able to see if I'm just running around. And of course, it's also an opportunity to immerse myself in self-metta. So what this has done for me is it's given me access to, um, well, I'll call it a sense of my higher self. And it's the part of me that knows what's right. It it sort of knows deep down in my bones what's the best and wisest thing to do in any given moment when I'm able to, um, speak and act from that place. It's a place of intuition, of knowing with my heart and not just my intellect. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this place. I know everyone's touched into it at one point or another. It's that place that, if you ever caught yourself writing some flaming angry email at somebody, it's the part of you that says, maybe I'd better pause and save this and not send it today, and I'll sleep on it and reread it tomorrow, right? We've all done that, I'm sure. And that's the part of us that I'm talking about, the one that just knows, like, something's not quite right here, and I think I better do something different. And I'm not just talking, when I say self-care, I'm not just talking about meditation or Tai Chi and those kinds of practices. It's really anything we do that feels restful and recharges and re-energizes us. So, it could be something like listening to music, listening to Beethoven, Ode to Joy, like what Sravaniya was playing for us. For some people, it's being out in nature, soaking up the outdoors and letting that revive us. So I'm not just talking about, um, practices in the formal sense of the term. By the way, hanging out on Facebook or binging on Netflix does not count as self-care in my mind, because there's a difference between self-care and escapism, right? So I'm not talking about escapism here. I'm not saying don't do those things, because we all need to do that. We all need to chill sometimes. So, I'm not saying don't do those things, but self-care is really about taking the time to quietly be fully with ourselves and to put on those glasses that allows us to see ourselves under a different light. Paramananda, in his book, A Deeper Beauty, refers to that part of us as the soul, which is a little bit problematic word in Buddhism, but nonetheless. Let me read you a quote from his book. What's really still alive is the human soul, a genuine human quality that has its roots with a deeper intimacy with ourselves. If we have a real awareness of ourselves, we can also have confidence to act from what is best in us. It is this kind of awareness and confidence that Plato attributes to Socrates in the Apology. Socrates is on trial for his life before 500 men of Athens because of his relentless pursuit of the truth and his tenacity for exposing the superficiality of others. He refuses to plead for his life and goes to his death with a peaceful heart in the knowledge that he has lived his life in the service of the good and the true. So that's self-care, much more than car maintenance. My second principle is don't try to fix samsara. In the realm of bodhisattvahood, it kind of goes without saying that we really care about something passionately. And the problem with that is that there's a danger we can get so passionate about something that we get fixated on it. And then that gets us into trouble. And in my case, where that leads me is that there's a danger that I keep saying yes to that one more request or that one more volunteer project or one more thing that I could do that is, giving the Dharma, giving a talk, helping others, especially if it's something that we love doing. Order members fall into this trap all the time. If it's something that we also happen to be pretty good at doing, it's really easy to just keep saying, yeah, I'll do it. Or we feel like, because I know something about a subject, I feel like I have to educate everyone about it. And I don't mean being a smarty pants about it, but we feel like we need to get on Facebook and voice our opinion about this is the true way to look at it. Or joining into a political conversation because we really care about the state of our country. So I'm kind of drawing the line here. There's a fine line between being passionate about something versus taking the whole project on so whole hog that we are actually trying to fix samsara all by ourselves, which is obviously ridiculous. How can I possibly address the suffering of all humanity all by myself? But if I keep jumping in at every possible opportunity that I have to do that, it's kind of like saying, well, I'm going to give it a try. And that's the kind of trap I'm talking about. So here's another instance where it serves us well to pause in the gap that Shudayu so beautifully described for us yesterday and allow for a more creative response to arise rather than our unthinking reactivity. How about pausing and considering, what is my realistic sphere of influence here? What's realistically within my range of capabilities and my talents and personality? Am I genuinely helping here? Or am I just jumping in because I'm anxious about wanting to do something? During what seemed like an endless election cycle this past year, during the primaries and the general election, it seemed like everybody I knew was getting involved in phone banking and sending postcards and, all that kind of stuff. And I consciously decided not to do that, despite what felt like peer pressure to do it. Because first of all, I'm a pretty extreme introvert. So cold calling strangers is something I just really hate doing. I also don't relish the thought of getting into tons of political, emotional discussions with a whole bunch of people hour after hour. I mean, that just would totally drain me. And a friend of mine came up with a wonderful analogy, which gave me a lot of confidence about the choice that I made about how to face this election. And the analogy is, think about the people who trek up to the summit of Mount Everest, and they get all the glory. They're the ones who are most visible for making that difficult, arduous climb up to the top. But actually, they didn't do it alone, right? Because for every climber, there was a huge team of support people who trained them how to do it safely, who cooked their meals, who prepared their equipment and carried their supplies and provided a restful base camp for them to be able to do the trek. So I concluded that I am one of those people in the base camp. I may not be on the front lines. You'll never see me making the news as the person who made climb to the summit of Mount Everest. You'll never see me there. But I am right behind them, metaphorically, because I'm one of the ones at the base camp providing every bit of support I can for them, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. And that is my form of activism, what fits my personality, my capabilities, and my talents. So your form of activism might look different. Well, it will look different from mine because everyone's a different person, obviously, but the same principle can apply. So I want to urge you to not feel guilty about not doing enough. Especially if you are, you have a full-time job and you've got a family that you're raising, small children. Maybe you have elderly parents that you're taking care of, right? Um, you can still be a bodhisattva. It doesn't mean that you are not doing enough, because your bodhisattva work could be, for example, being a positive influence at work with your colleagues, um, being a caring and supportive friend to them, giving your children a loving home so that they grow up into upstanding moral beings, able to do their work in the world, right? That's enough. It really is. And if that's the most sustainable way that you know and can handle to give out care into the world, then please stop feeling guilty. The world needs all kinds of support, not just those who are visibly marching on the front lines. So that's principle number 2. Don't try to fix samsara all by yourself, because first of all, it can't be fixed. Remember that the first noble truth is that suffering is always going to be there as a characteristic of human suffering, or of human life. So don't kid yourself into thinking that you can reverse the first noble truth. All we can do is meet suffering with kindness and care and ease the suffering of the person immediately in front of us. And that's really all we can realistically do. My third principle is that you're not in this alone. So something happened to me personally a couple of weeks ago that turned out to be a rather important Dharma lesson for me. I have a old chronic ankle injury that acts up from time to time, and even as of today, I'm actually having a hard time walking on it. As of about a week ago, I was not able to put any weight on it at all. I was walking around with crutches, and um, my husband, who happens to be disabled and in a wheelchair, we spent one weekend trading off using his wheelchair, which turned out to be kind of comical, actually. But as you can imagine, with me being the caregiver for my husband and being on crutches, that kind of threw my life into chaos, trying to get through life for both of us with just me on crutches. Well, it turned out that when I started telling my friends that this was happening to me, I was just really touched by how many of my friends and neighbors came forward and offered to help me. Now, I shouldn't have been surprised, but on some level I was, because I have another one of these unhelpful personality tendencies. And I tend to think of myself as independent and self-sufficient and capable, and I can do it myself. I don't need anyone to help me. And this isn't an ego thing. It's just a mental habit that I've had and since I was a small child, that I just felt like, I can just do this myself. I don't need anyone to help me. And I'm just realizing how unhelpful and limiting that can be. And so several of my friends went out shopping and running errands for me, friends and neighbors. And my good friend Vrialila, after she delivered a bag of groceries to me, she said, "Thank you for allowing me to help you." And that really struck me. because what was happening here was the flip side of generosity, which is receiving. It's two sides of the same coin. Because when I allow someone to give to me, I'm actually being generous by graciously receiving their generosity. That is how I can be generous to someone who is giving to me. And Viryalila rightly thanked me for that opportunity. So this was an excellent reminder to me to stop thinking that I need to do this all by myself. Narottama yesterday in some of the comments toward the end of the day said something to this effect. He sort of said it in passing, but it's a very important point that we are part of an interconnected Sangha. We're not alone. And when we join in with our Sangha mates, there's so much more that becomes possible. It's not just about me being able to get groceries. Right? There's so much more that happens when we are in this sort of deeper relationship with those around us. There's the image of Avalokiteshvara, who is the Bodhisattva of compassion. And I'm going to bring up a screen share here. This is Avalokiteshvara, statue of this Bodhisattva. His most visible and enduring quality is compassion, his willingness to jump out and help anyone who is in need. And he's said to have 1,000 arms, each one holding a different implement. As you can see here, couple of the hands up front, you can see are holding different tools. And each hand is ready to reach out to help others and relieve suffering with whatever is necessary, whatever is being called for in the moment, using whatever tools he has within his means. Within Triratna, we talk about each of us as being a hand of Avalokiteshvara. And as a Sangha, we are Avalokiteshvara stepping out into the world. So it's not me trying to be Avalokiteshvara all by myself. It's that I am one of his hands, one of his arms. And each one of us has a different tool to offer in terms of our different skills and personalities. And as a collective, we are able to make a difference in the world. So if the state of our country is bringing you down, as it is for me, and you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed and helpless, perhaps even edging into cynicism, if you're feeling scared or defeated, again, you're not alone. But keep in mind that it's not up to us individually by ourselves to face this. How about if we hold up our end of the universe, our small corner of the universe, contributing our own positive influence in our own small corner of the world, knowing that there are 999 other hands of Avalokiteshvara doing the same thing. That's really the only way that we're going to change the world, so to speak, if we all join together and do this work together. So I just lost my notes, darn it. I'm going to have to ad lib because I lost my notes. The Buddha said that friendship is the whole of the spiritual life. And I think this is what he was referring to. You can say that spiritual friendship is a great way that we support each other in our practice, keep each other honest. That's sort of the car maintenance analogy of spiritual practice. But clearly, the Buddha was talking about something much deeper than that when he said friendship is the whole of the spiritual life. Because it's only when we join in with our community around us, with our Sangha, not only our Buddhist friends, but really all of humanity. When we join in with everyone and together as a collective, we become greater than the sum of our individual parts. And so together we are able to accomplish something far more than anything that each of us as any individual person could possibly accomplish. So those are the main things that I wanted to address today. So self-care as a means toward self-knowledge and self-awareness and connecting with your deeper sense of self. Don't try and fix everything by yourself. Don't try to fix samsara, because suffering will always be there. And 3, you're not alone. So let's not forget that we are part of an interconnected Sangha of loving beings out doing the same work together. Thank you.